Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Heike Barakat, and it's my honor to introduce the next four speakers. I hope you have picked up their biographies. As they're all distinguished in many ways, I simply introduced them shortly here. The world is facing many challenges considering demography and education, the promotion of democracy. And today, four distinguished speakers and members of the International Scientific Advisory Board of the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital will consider these challenges from their own perspective. First, we will hear from Sir Partha, the chair of the advisory board. Professor Partha is Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of St. John's College, as well as Professorial Research Fellow at the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. Following Sir Partha, Professor McKinwar is going to give her perspective on demographic and education challenges in Africa. Professor McKinwar is a fellow of the Social Science Academy of Nigeria and has been a YUSSP laureate for an outstanding contribution to African demography. She has been director of the Food Security and Sustainable Development Division of the UN Commission for Africa. Subsequently, we will hear Sir David, who has been the UK's government's Chief Science Advisor and Head of Government Office of Science. In that time, he raised the profile of the need for governments worldwide to act on climate change and was instrumental in creating the new £1 billion Energy Technologies Institute. Professor David King is the first director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment in Oxford and will introduce us to mental capital tonight. The fourth member who's going to speak to us today is Demis Hopte, pediatrician who currently is president of the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences and former professor and chairman of the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, as well as the dean of the faculty. He has had a distinguished career in international public health with the World Bank and in Bangladesh, and he's going to speak on global health and education.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Wolfgang, ladies and gentlemen. I'm an economist by training and inclination. So I sort of see the world through the lens of economists, but I hope I expand beyond that. The art of good social science research is to try and identify processes, general processes that drive societies, communities, but which might reveal themselves, manifest themselves in different ways, in different cultures, in different times, in different places. But the idea is to identify them as similar in some respect, and it's in that respect that I want to raise some points with you here. Classical political economists, Smith, Ricardo in particular, and in part Marx as well, saw the progress or regress of nations in terms of the accumulation of reproducible capital. Those giants, of course, spoke of many other things too, but the thrust of their vision was over the accumulation of capital, seen as buildings, machines, objects that run our lives. Labor took, in some sense, a back seat. The subsistent wage theory suggests we were thinking of labor as raw labor power. And of course, they had quite a bit to say, and Malthus in particular, over demographic matters which Professor Lutz is a world expert. It's only in the last 50, 60 years that the scope of the identification of capital assets has expanded beyond measure. We now include natural capital, we include human capital, institutional capital, and knowledge, generally thought, in the general sense, By knowledge, you can think at an extreme pieces of information like the differential calculus, the integral calculus, the works of Goethe, and so forth. Human capital components, health and education. Education in particular would be seen as skills, in some sense codified or embedded in the person who has acquired that capital. Knowledge, on the other hand, in the sense that I'm thinking of, is of course pervasive out there. And the two together can do things beyond imagination, at least certainly earlier imagination. And I will come back to the synergy between knowledge in the sense of public goods and skills as embodied in human beings in a minute. More recently, a number of economists have shown that a necessary condition for human well-being to be sustained over time, and by sustained I mean not declining, but increasing, or at least at the worst, keeping constant. A necessary condition for that is the accumulation of what we now call inclusive wealth. When Smith wrote on the Wealth of Nations, he didn't quite have that in mind, but it is fortuitous that he thought about the wealth of nations, or he wrote about the wealth of nations, not the GNP of nations, or the Human Development Index of nations. He was thinking of the wealth of nations. Inclusive wealth is an aggregate of reproducible capital, human capital, institutional capital, knowledge, and natural capital. The question arises, of course, to what extent these forms of capital, which are themselves very aggregate, are substitutable amongst one another. How much you can do without one if you accumulate the other. Up to a point, of course, they are substitutable. Double glazing is a good example of how reproducible capital substitutes for energy. But these are seemingly trivial examples, but they run deep. On the other hand, intuition suggests, experience shows that beyond a point, it's not substitutability, it's really these elements are complements. Now, these are commonplace expressions of concern, and our concern with sustainable development really arises out of the fact that we may be running out of certain types of resources even while accumulating others, and that won't do. That is to say, they're complements. When I say complements, I have in mind extreme versions. Extreme version of complements would be left and right shoe. If you have left shoes but not a right shoe, then you won't be very comfortable walking. You need both, and they complement one another. You can't substitute a right shoe for a left shoe. If you have two left shoes, life is not going to be very pleasant. Of course, complementarity doesn't mean extreme form of complementarity. Essentially, we want to ask the question whether, in some sense, the cost of substitution goes on rising as one of the objects of interest declines. The substitutability, or rather the lack of substitutability I've just now mentioned, is over capital assets at a particular point in time. I want to now conclude my observations by pointing to a very treacherous form of complementarity that occurs over time, and that has to do with the accumulation of human capital. It is something that I've been working on for about 25 years to be more precise. It arose out of my interest in trying to understand rural poverty in the poorest countries of the world, which included my own and of course, sub-Saharan Africa. At that time, China also suffered a good deal of poverty of the kind that I have in mind. I was interested in trying to understand what happens to a person when he or she is malnourished. Obviously, the pain and suffering, that's the easy bit to understand. The harder bit to understand is the loss of productivity and the person's place in the community or society he or she belongs to. Now, what does that have to do with complementarities? The complementarities have to do with the fact that start thinking of the education process. We're now looking at an aspect of human capital. It is now a commonplace that in a poor country, simply to have a classroom is not enough. If you have a classroom but absent teachers, students don't learn anything. If you have a classroom and teachers, but students come in hungry, children come in hungry in the morning, they're not going to learn very much. So there are complementarities at work there. Now, you have a classroom, teachers, and a child who has been fed. But if the child has suffered from iodine deficiency at infancy, then he will not be able, or she will not be able to learn very much. Now notice this example of iodine deficiency at infancy suggests that we are talking about human capital as a process of accumulation, but a process which starts very, very early. It starts in the placenta. It starts at conception. And we need to track a person's life from conception to death as a sequence of events, as a process through in which inputs are continually being fed into the child, the person, and he or she accumulates a form of capital which, of course, is the center of attention at the Wittgenstein Center. And those bits that are being added are not really fully substitutable. Of course, up to a point they are. There are periods when you can catch up from earlier deprivation, but the cost goes up. That's the whole idea of the complementarity that I'm talking about. But the matter doesn't even end there. Up to this point, I think I knew pretty much what was going on, at least at the nutrition science side of things, even 25 years ago. But now it turns out that, in fact, the process begins even earlier. I had sort of hints of it in the epidemiological literature, that the size of the mother matters in terms of the nourishment that the child receives in the womb, the size of the child at birth, and so forth. So in some sense, history matters, and it's the history which drives the future of a person. The concluding part of this, if this is all I had to say, you would say, well, this is very important, that history matters is something we take for granted. What follows? Well, what follows is that history not only matters, but it divides. You can imagine, as a thought experiment, two fetuses, very, very, very similar, in two wombs, but slightly different. And this historical process, the process of accumulation that I mentioned, the initial difference could accumulate if you have a slight deprivation, and that makes it more costly to make up. And if that is not available, the deprivation accumulates. This process can be shown, the history mattering can be shown to produce what one might call poverty traps. That is to say, very similar people to begin with, but not identical, move in different directions, such that one takes off into prosperity and the other stagnates, or worse, dies at birth. Now, the manifestation of this process, the fact that history can actually tear people away from one another, is something, of course, which manifests itself in different ways in different cultures. In rich countries, it wouldn't be quite this draconian. It'll be something else, perhaps. We talk about poverty traps in the UK, we talk about poverty traps in the United States, but those traps are very different in substance to the poverty traps that this kind of process manifests itself in, say, in India or in sub-Saharan Africa. But the process is similar. The process involves the fact that what is achievable today depends on what you experienced yesterday and day before, and so forth. And one of the most encouraging aspects of the program of research that Wittgenstein Center is embarking on is the observation that you really need to study educational attainment as a sequence of events, not a one-shot or an aggregate index of education. Thank you very much.